Corona Haikus, reflexive and evolutive agency as a strategy for individual and community change. When I moved from linear documentary production to the newly emerging field of interactive storytelling in the early 2000s, you can see me there, I was excited by the potentiality of the web, especially the possibilities of co-creation in factual storytelling. Looking back, I can clearly see that what attracted me was the exploration of how factual narratives could make use of two affordances that are unique to digital media: user agency and interactivity. More than 20 years later, I am still experimenting with ways to use interactivity to facilitate co-creation of reality and move away from simple representation in documentary making. In this paper, I will use Corona Haiku, the Corona Haiku project, to question the current understanding of user agency in participatory interactive narratives. I have chosen such project because I have personally been involved in it as a co-author and also as a participant, and therefore I have both co-designed its user agency and experienced it as a user. I will argue that agency in interactive documentaries, which I will call iDocs, should be considered as a space of user empowerment that does not always have to affect the interactive narrative itself, because it can also be placed outside of the narrative and the story. The Corona Haikus example will be used to demonstrate that in participatory narratives, deep individual and societal impact can be designed by mixing different types of micro-agencies and by orchestrating them as a journey of empowerment that is gradual and evolutive. Reflexive and evolutive agencies will be defined and presented as new ways to approach impact design in interactive narratives. Agency in interactivity and iDocs. Agency and interactivity are two sides of the same coin. In user-computer interaction, the agent, seen as the one who initiates actions, can be more than one: the interactive author, the computer software, and also the user. The author makes actions possible by ideating them or by allowing the algorithm to generate them, while the user acts upon them. It is only once the choice is acted upon that user agency, defined as the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the result of our decisions and choices, is exercised. This well-known definition of agency by scholar Janet Murray was coined in 1997, a time where interactive narratives were in their infancy, and one of the few areas that had successfully used and explored user agency was the computer gaming field. In game culture, the players do take decisions and choices that need to feel satisfactory to them, because if not, they will actually stop playing. If we bring this notion of agency into the smaller world of iDocs, that is at the center of this paper, we understand why documentary scholar Adrian Miles said that in an iDoc, the interactor is pretty much asked to notice, decide, and do. Something is presented to a user, notice, the user views this material more or less quickly, decide, and then is then obliged to change within, to make a decision that is literally a motor action that affects some sort of change within or to the work, do. It is true that in early web docs, users' powers was effectively restricted to affect the work by browsing it. But past 2005, when the affordances of Web 2 allowed for users to become content generations themselves, and participatory media and culture started to spread, iDocs moves out of their hypertext interactive structure, and click and choose agencies and new types of doing started to be possible. As argued elsewhere, I believe that agency is platform and mode specific, and there can be more than one types of agency in an iDoc. This paper will argue that agency is more nuanced and complex than so far has been given credit to, and that authors can play with types, levels, and mutually affecting the agencies to create complex and evolutive agency. If I agree with the interactive documentary scholar Judith Aston that within an IDOC, a physical action needs to take place between the human and the computer, I then want to question, so what type of actions can be conceived? What is the effect of such action on the interactor and on the impact of the piece? So in the next part of this paper, I'll therefore address the following points. One, there are many possible types of doings that are possible outside of the click and doing option. Two, the space in which these doings are happening do not need to be constrained to the interactive artifact itself. Three, the what can the interactor do and the where does this action take place can have a variety of different impacts. And four, agency could be thought as evolutive and systemic. And then in the last part of the paper, we use the Corona Haikus project to study and explore possible answers that actually came from my own praxis. But first, the many types of doing in IDOCs. In the taxonomy of interactive documentaries that I proposed in my PhD, I have argued that different digital media platforms afford different modes of interactivities, and that the doings that are possible for the user can be substantially different in a web documentary, in a game, a locative, or an immersive narrative. The four modes of interactivity that I proposed in my PhD for interactive documentary are the hypertext, the conversational, the participatory, and the experiential mode. And I highlighted then how each mode uses a different logic of relationality between story, computer, human, and environment, and therefore has different affective and cognitive consequences. They also therefore use totally different type of agencies. Two, spaces of doings and reflexive agency. While in most interactive documentaries, the agency of the user is designed and conceived as a space of action within the proposed story of the artifact, both locative and participatory mode have the potential to empower the user within the space of their own life rather than the one of the IDOC work. Participatory narrative, by the simple fact that they ask to create something that will later have to be shared, for example, record an audio in the Corona Diaries, a project from 2021, or shoot a video from Life in a Day, project 2012, or make digital poetry, as we will see in the Corona Haikus 2021. They create a pose for the interactive documentary that moves the agency of the user outside of the digital artifact. And by doing so, the agency of doing in participatory storytelling proposes an interval, a potential moment of personal introspection, of creativity, of questioning, that re-empowers the participant within her unlimited possibilities of being. And being, in this case, is intended as being creative, curious, observer, voiceful, funny, being whatever is actually needed within the framework of the piece, but for sure, being in touch with the self. Since any act of creativity starts from an affective and emotional connection with some part of ourselves. From an agency options, from all the agency options that are possible in the context of participatory factual narratives, I therefore would like to highlight the option of reflexive agency, intended as the meaningful power given to the user to interact with the self. When the doings calls for reflection, internal tuning, emotional assessment, and then some form of expression of this personal internal recalibration, then I believe the space of transformation that agency allows is directly impacting the interactor, her inner world, and her self-awareness. 3, the impact of doings. I would argue that we cannot separate the discourse of agency from the one of impact. If in existing theories of documentary impact, changing minds is recognized as one of the 4 types of impacts that can be designed for, and this comes from Doc Society, then the interactive documentary, this must be intrinsically linked with the type of doings that are made possible within an IDOC. Since we make sense of the world through movement and action, Varela, Thompson, and Roche, 1991, our doings are not just a way of navigating a story or of creating content, but our very way to make sense of what we are engaging with. When the space of interaction is the idox text itself, then our making sense is focused to the story world. But when the space of the action is reflexive, hence within ourselves, then our doings are reframing our emotional internal balances and our connection with the physical world, or even the awareness of such relationship. Therefore, when agency is intended as doing and creating and looking inward, rather than clicking and choosing within the story, this action can become a moment of eternal recalibration and mindfulness. When agency also allows sharings with others, then the private space moves into the public sphere and engenders a new level of potential community transformation. This is where agency can be designed as evolutive for the user. Evolutive agency, a whole that is more than its parts. If we look at agency as a systemic construct, where the whole is more than in single parts, then thinking of agency as single type of action in an interactive story is very limitative. I would argue that designing agency as evolutive and systemic forces us to question what types of agencies are possible, when should they be proposed, and in which order, who is empowered by doing so, and what is being transformed by it. If the impact of the individual user can be seen as a series of internal shifts, then designing evolutive agency means to plan a choreography of successive opening and personal empowerments that only work because each step has its own purpose and makes possible the following ones. In the next and final part of this paper, I will use the Corona Haikus project as a case study to highlight possible ways to step out of the click and choose notion of agency and experiment with reflexive and evolutive agency as a strategy for individual and societal change. So the Corona Haikus case study then. Corona Haikus is a collaborative documentary project that uses social media and visual poetry to document the first phase of lockdown worldwide. Launched as a Facebook group on the 1st of April 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic brought most countries to close their border and announce lockdown measures, the projects were thought as a communal way to respond to the fear of being isolated and the need to create a safe space to feel connected. The project was co-initiated by myself and Colombian transmedia producer Sandra Gaudenzi, and for more than 10 weeks, we acted both as co-authors of the group and co-creators of digital poetry. You can see here the first post, actually. Corona Haiku was therefore a form of constructive narrative resistance, where a new type of digital poetry, 3 photos and a short text, to be shared on Facebook, was used to co-create a poetic tapestry of our Corona lives. The community grew to over 1,000 members within the first 10 weeks of the project and generated more than 2,000 visual haikus coming from people from all around the world. When the first lockdown then gradually started to ease, participants were asked to say goodbye to the community in the form of a visual haiku and to choose the moment they felt right to stop documenting their public lives. And after that, a website, coronahaikus.com, was co-curated to archive a selection of the Corona haikus created by the community and to make them available to a larger public that might not be active on Facebook. So let's go back to the 4 points seen before, but now adapted to the Corona Haikus project. 1, reflexive agencies. At a first glance, it would be easy to say that the participants' agency was just to create and share a visual haiku. This would simplify the interaction design to what is often called user-generated content. But I would like to take a more nuanced approach and question what forms of doings are necessary in order to create a Corona visual haiku. After all, the posted Corona haiku is only the final result of a series of actions undertaken by the maker, each of which creates a series of affective emotional opening for the participant, which I believe are the place where individual transformation is really possible. One would therefore need to analyze how many assemblages of mini acts, each of which necessitate a different form of agencies, are made possible for the participant. In order to create a visual haiku about your life in isolation, one first needs to connect to the moment itself. This means stopping any doing and connecting with the felt sense of the present moment, which is in itself an act of mindfulness. So the very first step of agency and level of agency offered by the project is therefore to step out of the collective narrative exposed in the Corona Haiku Facebook group and to enter into a physical space, into your own private narrative space. Where am I right now? How do I sense the physical space around me? And what emotions does it generate in me? At a time where we were all rediscovering our houses with new eyes, the first doing was to become aware of our new glances to our own very private spaces, and then to notice how new life patterns were actually influencing us. This is a reflexive moment made possible by what I have called earlier reflexive agency, the meaningful power given to the user to interact with the self. The second level of doing is to embrace such act of reflexivity and find ways to express it through visual poetry. Using a mobile phone to take photos is an act of reframing. By taking 3 photos, it is now not just a single moment that is framed, but a micro-narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end of a moment that now starts to make sense to the author because it unfolds in time. At this specific moment, the agency of the visual haiku maker is both of allowing the self to be creative and to experiment with the possibilities of the moment. Reflexive agency is therefore expansive. It offers a space of potentialities to be lived by the participant, precisely because now she is the author. For a short interval of time, the story to be explored and expressed is the one of the self, not the one of the community, and not the one of the external author either. As a result, the impact of reflexive agency is a form of introspection that can be described as an act of self-care. This is how we defined it in a previous article with myself, Kermanchi, and Weil in 2021. Because it calls for the participant to have self-centered and to find her own voice. Point 2, agencies and spaces of doings in the Corona Haiku project. If reflexive agency has been described as a first step that connects the participant to her emotional state, the next step is to translate what is still an affective intuition into a conscious narrative by using the language of a visual haiku. The act of creation is in itself a space of experimentation which uses trials and errors as a canvas for self-discoveries. Let me play some of this as I continue. How many times have I tried different combinations of photos and changed the text because the result simply did not feel right to me? In doing so, I was exercising my creative agency and my ability to use poetry as an interface and in between the feeling inside myself and the world outside of me. Giving creative agency to the participant is yet another level of self-empowerment. The third level of agency in Corona Haikus is the agency to share. This is the moment where the space of possibilities of an expansion given to the individual becomes public, and therefore the impact of the visual poetry moves from an individual to a community level. Sharing requires daring, but it also is an act of belonging. By sharing content, the participant chooses to be publicly seen as a co-author and opens herself to the judgment and comments of others. The fourth level of agency is the one of commenting to other people's visual haikus. This allows the participant to connect to a wider community at a more intimate level. In a previous article, the effect of this networked agency has actually been described as an act of community care. Next. Third point, the complex impacts of the doing in the Corona Haiku project. By looking at agency as complex, we can understand why a project like Corona Haikus has different levels of impact. Reflexive agencies tend to have an impact at a strictly individual level because the doings is internal and introspective. Awareness, acceptance, mindfulness, change of perspective are internal changes that can be transformational to the user, to the individual, but that are difficult to quantify and to be seen by others. Creative agency, on the other hand, builds on reflexive agencies and transforms emerging needs and internal states in artifacts that are tangible and shareable. In the case of Corona Haikus, each visual haiku is a poetic utterance that has a double impact. It transforms an intuition into a conscious message for the creator, and it also makes the creator visible to others. The moment creative agency is followed by sharing agency, and the Corona Haiku is visible by the Facebook community group, then the impact moves from an individual to a community level because each single visual poetry has an impact on the receiver. Community members can be touched, feel welcome, understood, hold, or even just feel that they belong to a group of like-minded people. Finally, the agency to comment on Facebook has also both a personal and community level of impact. By commenting to other visual haikus, the participants earn her belonging to the community and feels connected, empathic, and somehow useful to others. Yet at the same time, the community itself becomes alive, stimulated, and stimulating. Comments comes, call for more comments, and dialogue is made possible. During the first 10 weeks of the project, people that had never seen each other started to engage at an actually quite deep level. And clearly, the state of distress and trauma we endured during lockdown did help to create deep bonds between people. But I also believe that the design of a gradual expansion of personal agency has been a catalyst that has allowed deep exchange. Last point, evolutive agency. If we understand agency as evolutive, we can start designing it as a series of gradual openings that together, and because of their strategic positioning, do allow for a deeper change and impact. By analyzing the Corona Haiku project, we can see how sharing visual poetry is only possible when one feels entitled to do so, but also when one has something meaningful to share. Transformative user-generated content is therefore only possible if the conditions for introspection and internal connection have been designed through reflexive agency. Once this individual connection to the self has been made possible, then it is almost as if it allows for creativity and sharing. Had the same agencies been proposed in different times, the condition from gradual change would not have been there, and the impact would have been lower. Concluding, the argument behind this paper is that agency should not be seen as a series of successive and independent doings and choices, but as a systemic and evolutive construct. The Corona Haiku call for participation was very specific. It asked people to document their moods, feelings, and life while in isolation through a very focused format of 3 photos and a short text. The design of such call has the intent to focus participant to the here and to the now. This paper has looked at the evolutive agencies of Corona Haiku as an assemblage of different types of agencies that unfold in time and that build on each other's effect, ultimately creating a layered and pluridimensional impact that touches both individual and the community. Finally, the Corona Haikus project has been used to demonstrate that agency in interactive factual storytelling do not does not need to be limited to the act of choosing within authorial predetermined options, nor needs to focus on the story itself. Reflexive agencies can well take the participant outside of the collaborative narrative and act within a total private space. And this interval of self-reflective agencies might be precisely what makes a project more meaningful and transformative to its interactors. Thank you very much for your time.